Hey everyone, this is James Lindsay. You're listening to New Discourses Bullets, where I'm going to give you a short bullet point type summary of a single topic from woke Marxism that we need to understand so we can defeat it and stop it. And this might be a little bit of a dated topic now. I don't think it's dead, but this might be more of a moratorium, a look back. But I want to give you the full, clear explanation for why drag queens. Why drag queens? And I don't mean in the sense, we all know the answer. There's the meme, with the goose chasing the drag queen away or whatever, and it says, why don't you ever read your stories to old people in nursing homes? Why is it always children? We know why it's always children. I'm not going to talk about that. You can go listen to my Groomer Schools episode on Drag Queen Story Hour, where I read it in their own words, why it's children and what they're doing with them. The question is, why drag queens at all? And, I've given some answer to that in the past. There's some practical reasons why. There are some kind of very interesting, it's like, why a drag queen and not a stripper? That's a question, right? Why? Well, because obviously the stripper, given the behaviors, is not the problem. The stripper, the reason that they're not interested is because the stripper is not actually doing something queer. It's just breaking a norm, right? So why not do something queer in addition? A man dressed as a woman induces generative themes, is a generative theme himself. A man dressed as a woman invites the children to ask questions like, why is a man dressed as a woman? So that the educator can then reply, do men always have to dress like men, or can they dress like women if it makes them feel pretty? And then lead them into places like, don't you want to feel pretty sometimes, blah, blah, blah. And you can hear the whole nasty grooming idea. So we know why it's children, and we can see the very practical reason why it's drag queens is because they are just across the line of the queer line, but at the same time they present this kind of weirdly, gross to even say this, but in the pantheon of queer, it's true, this weirdly safe place to go. Oh, they're just a kind of performer. They're fun. They're like a clown. The kids might think it's interesting, and it's important to talk about gender these days, and right? So there are practical reasons why, because they're transgressive enough, but not too transgressive. You could get a lot worse, and in fact, it would if it was allowed to continue, but I don't think that it was going to get very far. Parents did not put up with this for very well. In fact, my low-key conspiracy theory is that the entire eruption in 2021 and 2022, or 22 and 23, whichever years it was, I guess it was 22 and 23 primarily, into the queer theory domain in public was overwhelmingly a provocation to try to draw violence from normal parents, especially if they could get it from a Christian conservative. I actually kind of suspect it was just a provocation, that its primary purpose was that, not even to indoctrinate kids or whatever else. But this is all beside my point. What I want to talk to you about is Judith Butler. So Judith Butler is one of the people that I've referred to in my book Cynical Theories as one of the fairy godmothers of queer theory. And Judith Butler is a lesbian woman who has been as committed as anyone can be to every goofball left-wing cause throughout all of her career. She's famous for being almost impenetrable to read. Her sentence, she won, I think, either the award or second place for the worst sentence ever written at some point, something like that. She's famously difficult to parse. There are reasons to believe that what she's saying is mostly nonsense, but she is one of the founding members of the school of thought called queer theory that I've identified as queer Marxism. She is a very heavily analyzed character, proportionally speaking at least, in my more recent book with Logan Lansing called The Queering of the American Child. So if you want to understand more of her theory, you can go ahead and look there. She wrote two very famous books. She's been very prolific, but she wrote two very famous books in the early 90s. One is called Gender Trouble. That's probably the most famous thing she wrote. She wrote that in 1990. And then she wrote a follow-up work called Bodies That Matter in 1993. So what I want to do is I want to tell you that I could talk for a long time about Judith Butler and her different ideas, but her primary idea was something called gender performativity. This is probably her most famous idea. Gender performativity. Gender, what we call gender, whatever is meant by the word gender, and not a synonym for sex in queer theory, some disembodied sex that doesn't actually refer to your sex, right? It's some sense of sex without sex actually under that. Okay, so this is allegedly what gender is. Gender is, according to Judith Butler, performed. It is a performance. In fact, it's a self-reinforcing and self-creating performance. And she has this famous line where she quotes Michel Foucault, who is, in my opinion, the founder of queer theory. He was a postmodern theorist leading up to her, famously, and for this regard, wrote the book called The History of Sexuality. He also, which I think is the foundational work of queer theory, but he also wrote books about the nature of madness as a social construct to control people. He wrote books about Discipline and Punish is the title of one of his books, which is about basically that we live in a Gnostic prison of social control. And anyway, I bring all that up because he has this line that he says it's not so much that the body imprisons the soul as it is that the soul imprisons the body. And Judith Butler quotes that line, if I'm not mistaken, I'd have to double check, in both of her books from the 1990s, but she quotes him more than once and elaborates on this particular line. So she's taken with it. But her idea, drawing off of another guy that she kind of misappropriates, whose name is J.L. Austin, who came up with the idea of performativity, which is kind of like, if you're a judge or a cop, there's like a way to be a judge when you're being professional or a cop. And so you have judgeness or copness. In a sense, you're doing a performance. You put on the robe if you're a judge, you do the thing, you talk like a judge, you say the judge things. But when you're just, Joe Blow down the street, when you're not being a judge, when you're grilling out with your family or whatever else, then you're not performing being a judge. And so he has this whole idea that the judge thing comes into being because of the performance of being a judge, and same with cops and so on and so forth. Well, Judith Butler takes this and imports it and mixes it with all the Foucault and Derrida postmodern stuff, and she comes out with this idea of gender performativity, that gender is this thing that is done, performed, rather than something that is intrinsic to who you are. So remember, the first step with queer theory with gender is that it is a disembodiment of a sense of how you are as a sexed person, having a sex, male or female. It's a sense of sex without actual sex. So you disembody it. And then what Judith Butler says, is that gender is always performed. So I grow up male, and so I learn to be male in my presentation, and I learn the male gender performance from my society, from my parents, from my peers, from my TV and movies, from all of my input. So I learn to be masculine. I learn to be male. I learn to have a male gender, and I perform that, causing other people around me to see me as a teacher as well. So I'm performing masculinity, and other men or women, both, will see me perform masculinity along with every other man, and will say that's what it means to be masculine, and one will then enforce that on more people. Hey, this is how you have to be masculine. You have to act like this to be a boy, and you have to act like this to grow up to be a man. And so everybody's playing this part in this theater performance of their sex. That is the idea of gender performativity. That is the idea at the center of Judith Butler's work. And there's a way to boil that down to a 6-word phrase that it really encapsulates everything she has to say. All of her complicated, worst sentence ever written, books and books and books, can be boiled down to about 6 words. And those 6 words are: drag is life and life is drag. What does that mean? Well, it means essentially that we are all performing drag all the time. Okay? So I'm male and I'm performing my masculinity. So I'm a man doing male drag. I'm a male drag king. And you could pick your favorite woman out there, and she's performing her femininity, her womanhood. So she's performing that. So she is a female drag queen. And then you have some people who are drag queens. They are men who decide to perform intentionally, deliberately as a woman, knowing it's a performance. And then there are things called drag kings that are women, typically, who perform as though they are a man, knowing it's a performance. And so the only difference between the drag queen or king and everybody else is that the drag performer knows they're performing, whereas all the rest of us don't know we're performing. Well, you could become aware of gender performativity, awaken to the so-called truth of gender performativity, and then you, whether you decide to be in drag explicitly as in cross-sex drag or not, you could be aware that you are in fact performing your gender. And you could be a male drag king, and you could be a female drag queen, which sounds like a kind of a oxymoron, but the fact of the matter is, for Judith Butler, everybody's doing drag of one sex or another, or neither, or something else. Like your furry kids, like your non-binaries, those are some something else's and neithers. Everybody's doing drag all the time. This is literally the crazy pants belief of gender performativity in queer theory. So the only people who know that it's all a farce, the only people who actually understand it, the only people who are enlightened to the true state of reality are the drag queens and drag kings who do it on purpose. So what you end up with is that drag kings and drag queens, this is going to sound completely insane, except that what I just said backs it all up. Drag queens and drag kings, primarily drag queens in this world for probably very obvious reasons if we think about them for not very long, are priests of the queer religion. They are priests of the queer religion, and Drag Queen Story Hour becomes an initiation ritual for children. You don't need to do it in the nursing home because you don't need to initiate old people who aren't going to accept it and are probably about to die. You need to initiate children who might accept it and who have their entire lives ahead of them. You need to, and especially the might accept it part, you need to initiate children into this, to the cult, the religious cult of queer theory. And the priest who can do that induction is the drag queen. And why is the drag queen qualified to be able to do that induction? Because the drag queen knows he's performing gender. He knows that gender is a performance. He's seen through the lie of the play that we're all playing in without knowing it. In other words, he's had a Gnostic awakening and is therefore able to be a Gnostic priest in the gnosis of gender ideology that he can then pass on to the people that he's teaching, which in this case would be children. So thinking of drag queens as gender priests in a twisted religion that believes that gender has nothing to do with who you actually are, nothing to do with your sex, but is this free-floating signifier that's up for grabs and in fact can and should be twisted around and challenged and distorted and perverted. That queer theory, queer Marxist, I should say, religion has drag queens as priest figures because they are enlightened to the nature of gender performativity, which makes them therefore the absolutely perfect person to be able, or type of person to send into a school to do the ritual of inducing children into the queer theory or queer Marxist mindset or cult. So that's why drag queens, because drag queens in queer theory are the only people who actually understand what gender really is, which is that it's a performance, and that as a performance that inscribes power on people. Remember, the soul imprisons the body. Your expectations about how you're supposed to live your life imprison your body and make it a certain way. If you're masculine, you make it look masculine. If you're feminine, you try to keep it looking feminine. That's an imprisonment of your body. These are the priests who can break you free of that prison through their transgressive, gender-bending activity. And they can introduce that to children in a way that somehow flies under the radar. But it's very crucial to understand that this is a cult religion and that the drag queens are believed to be the people who get it, whereas everybody else is in the dark. They are the enlightened masters. They are the gurus. They are the priests of this religion. So instead of drag queen, think of them as drag priests in a dark, twisted religion, and you'll understand them better.